On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.
The election is over, and it's time to move on. Within the Jewish community, we are in a time of history and remembering. Passover and Shavuot, yes, but Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, and Yom HaAtzmaut. How do those feel 77 years later, post-October 7th? I'm Avi Feingold, born and raised in the great city of Montreal. I'm joined by free agent rabbi and the spiritual leader of Winnipeg Simpkins Center, Matthew Leibel, and associate editor at the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization, born and raised in Toronto, Yedida Eisenstadt. From the CJN, we are not in heaven. The election's done. For the most part, it validated the predictions that the Liberals were making a huge comeback. For me, the story that encapsulated the Jewish community's approach to this election was seeing Anthony Housefather retaining his seat in Mount Royal, despite the Jewish community publicly backing Neil Oberman, while another prominent Jewish MP, Yara Sachs, lost her seat to Roman Baber, who was a former MPP who was then kicked out by the Ford administration and now is poised to represent the Conservative Party in Toronto. Matthew, I also saw that Marty Morantz lost his riding. What's the mood like in the Winnipeg Jewish community today?
I mean, I can never for a second pretend to speak for everybody, so I got to make sure that I don't do that. But I think that there's always going to be a certain sense of disappointment when a Jewish incumbent loses a seat to a non-Jewish, someone who is not Jewish who is running. But at the same time, and I kind of mentioned this when we were talking last week, the very riding next door to Marty's riding, the riding in which I live, our MP who was reelected is Jewish. So I think that there's still a feeling of a voice, at least for Winnipeg Jewry in Ottawa, being there. It was nice, without question, to have a voice on both sides. But the fact that there's still a little bit of presence, I think, makes it a little bit easier to swallow the fact. At the same time, this is a riding that it was recently redrawn. Doug Elfson has won this riding before, if I'm not mistaken. So it's not a complete shocker out of nowhere for this riding to flip like that. And so I think that there's more to it than just kind of saying, well, a Jewish guy had the riding and lost. How should we react to it? It's not quite as direct as that. But that's kind of my take on the whole situation.
Yedida, you were listening or watching the results come in. Anything pop out for you?
It was the most Canadian thing I've done in a very long time. And I was also really struck that I thought that all the people that CBC had on must have spent hours practicing all of the names of the ridings and of the candidates to pronounce them properly. And I had no idea. I was reminded of how place names in Canada. That was mostly what it was for me.
I think they have a cheat sheet. Andrew Coyne does not know how to pronounce all these names. I don't know. Maybe.
So that's what it was for me. In the sort of first phase, when the things were coming in from Atlantic Canada, I felt like we could hear the concern from the CBC reporters, not sure how things were going to go and how the night was going to shape up. And as more returns came in, it was interesting sort of to think about the patterns of how the returns come in Canada as opposed to the US. That's all.
Well, it's all counted by hand. I think that this was one of the first elections that didn't have results or major results happen within an hour or two. And it felt a little American that way. It felt more like the sports, watching sports like you were talking about last week, Matthew. Yeah. Anyways, moving on. Itamar Ben-Gvir made a stateside visit last week. The controversial Knesset member spoke at a number of venues, including the Shabtai Society at Yale, though some venues canceled his appearance. I've been wondering, how do we balance free speech with giving a platform to people who many find problematic? Yedida, you got any insights for us?
I think that I was mostly surprised that he was being given the platform, and then I was less surprised when I was sort of reading all the kerfuffle about it, and then he was kind of deplatformed. But the question of who gets to speak and where and when and who gets to make those decisions is a really tough one. And I think in particular in this case, what I've sort of observed through all the Facebook discussion of this event is that there seems to be a very different Overton window in North America as opposed to Israel. And so I see my Israeli friends yelling at my North American friends, that my North American friends who are deciding whether or not Itamar Ben-Gvir is somebody who should be given a soapbox or a platform or not, that they're really not hearing the voices of Israelis by saying that Ben-Gvir is beyond the pale. And I think that's an interesting perspective. I'm not necessarily sold on it. I think American Judaism and North American Judaism and Israeli Jews are always in a kind of discussion. I think we've really seen that also since October 7th of how to respond to these moments and whether you're in it or outside of it and how much skin you have in the game. All of that's really big and hard.
To me, the obvious thing that's difficult to deal with is that he is a member of Knesset. So as much as you may not like his opinions, he does represent officially a chunk of the population.
He's a minister, isn't he?
He is, yeah. He's the national security, meaning the internal, the police force, and the prisons. Moving on. This past Saturday night in Vancouver, a terrible tragedy occurred as a man in a vehicle rammed attendees of a Filipino heritage festival. As of now, 11 people are dead, dozens more are injured. And while at this time there's no reason to believe that the crime was hate-motivated, anytime a minority group is affected, others tend to see themselves in that story. Jewish community organizations sent out messages of solidarity, and the Vancouver Federation, set up a fundraising link. I genuinely feel for the Filipino community, and one of the thoughts that I had was echoed by BC Premier David Eby, who notes that Filipinos are prominent in healthcare and childcare in all of Canada, and he says we're going to stand by with them and support them just like they support us. It's their turn to get care from us, and that hit me right away. I was like, oh, I bet you Matthew has a lot of people where he's working at the Simkin Center that are Filipino, that are in these helping professions. Matthew, what's been the mood in the past couple of days?
I haven't had a chance to talk to a lot of people, but to speak to what you brought up is exactly true. Like a huge part of the population of people working at the Simkin Center, not just today, but for a long time, for decades, are Filipino people. And there's something about this particular event. I mean, unfortunately, we're hearing about these kinds of events all of the time. And it always hits you differently when you have a personal connection, right? We would love to be able to say that we have these personal connections with all people. And I think that's possibly a goal for a lot of people. But if I'm just being honest, like this one definitely hits in a different way. It's because of Simkin. It's because there are so many Filipino people working here, and not just working here, but the kind of work they do, right? The kind of work, working with elderly, working with people that I don't see a lot of other people lining up to work with people. I mean, there are people who work in healthcare, obviously, and with elderly at a nursing home like I am, but it just seems like Filipino people have just been drawn to this kind of very challenging, difficult, gut-wrenching, and yet so admirable and just such generous, selfless work. I mean, it's been proven. Also, I mean, I feel a connection too. And when I was young, my parents were both working a ton. I had a lot of friends whose parents were professionals, and there were a bunch of people I went to school with. That we had nannies. Sometimes they lived in, sometimes they were there for a few hours, a whole range. And without question, there were so many people from the Filipino community who were. I remember in my family, they were going to nursing school, and years later, my sister gets married, and they come because they were part of the family to attend my sister's wedding and sit at a table with me at my sister's wedding. Like this was they're my family. So when this sort of thing happens, it's very, it's always awful. And this one is just like an extra added level of awful, because I think that my story is not unique. And I know many, many Jewish and Filipino families who have intersected over the now generations. You know, people tell me about taking care of my mother, and now after they took care of my kids, and now they're back in my lives. I always see it from that perspective, but I also know it from the Filipino perspective too, being stopped by people who work here and just the fond memories they have of working with a family for 30 years or 40 years. I mean, that's something special. And then to hear on federations recognizing that and turning that into action, I mean, that to me is a great proof in the pudding right there.
Let's move on to our main topic. We're at the tail end of Yom HaZikaron, Yom Ha-Atzmaut. Last week was Yom HaShoah. These come at an interesting time in the calendar, right after Pesach, in the middle of Sfirat HaOmer. I don't know, I guess you don't get to strategically pick your Independence Day. But on the other hand, Yom HaShoah does have an interesting history with it, right? The date being picked as the commemoration of the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943, that day isn't without controversy either, right? Because many have objected to it. They say that Tisha B'Av is the day that traditionally we mourn all the tragedies in the Jewish community. And there's also an international day to commemorate the Holocaust in January. Yedida, you're somebody who thinks about history a lot more than I do now, even though I was studying history, way back in the day. What are your thoughts about Yom HaShoah before we move on to the other pieces?
So let me just pick on one piece of your question, which is that the question of whether Yom HaShoah should be its own day, which it is, right? The decision was made that Yom HaShoah is its own day of commemoration of those who fell in the Holocaust, those who were killed in the Holocaust. But it's Yom HaShoah ve'hagvura. We also commemorate Jews who tried to fight back. And that's part of had the choice to do it on the date when the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began. And I think that this gets to a kind of historical question and how we commemorate and think also about the Holocaust. Is the Holocaust a culmination of more than 2,000 years of anti-Jewish events? Is it another data point in this larger pattern? Or because of the scale and systematicity of it, is it a whole other thing separate from the way that we commemorate other times of destruction in Jewish history? I think I do fall into the camp of it's a whole other thing, but I think also a piece of it is that for the people who made the decision to set the commemoration on this day, it's fresh. It had just happened. People were still reeling from it. People had lost entire families, entire populations, entire towns, entire cities had been destroyed and murdered. So I think there's different ways of understanding how Yom HaShoah was established in that way.
You're pointing out something that they could have picked many other days that were notable in the Holocaust, but they deliberately picked one that was a week before the, Yom HaAtzmaut, right, to be able to put them together. And there's some way of being able to say, well, this happened and therefore this happened shortly afterwards.
There is a relationship, and we are, in this season of memory, and Yom HaShoah was set to be a week before Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, and to make that sort of overt political statement. So let's just explain what the statement is, that the Holocaust happened, and because now there's a state of Israel, it can never happen again, and it will never happen again. And in the course of that, also to commemorate Israel's fallen and those who've died in protecting Israel and Israelis and Jews. And I think that really gets to the question of commemorating all of these days right now, because a lot of, in the wake of October 7th, Israel, right, part of why Jews are so shaken by October 7th is the notion that the idea that we thought the state of Israel would always protect us and protect Jews and this would never happen again has been shaken.
The when they placed Yom HaShoah thing, I get it, but I think they totally blew it. But anyway, we can get back to it.
Go ahead.
Tell us.
I totally think they blew it on where they picked Yom HaShoah. Am I allowed to say that? Is that I just wanted, can I just say very, very quickly something a little bit lighthearted? Because these days carry a lot of somber weight, and you're not supposed to make a joke. But I just wanted to share this. I felt this was the right place. I work at a place where most of my staff here who I work with, most of my colleagues at Simkin Center are not Jewish. I was getting to this conversation the other day with someone was saying, what, yum this and yum that? There's a lot of yum stuff. And I said, yeah, but you have to remember, that's getting freaked out because it's Memorial Day, Remembrance Day, Victoria Day. That's just our word for day. We just put it at the beginning. Oh, yes. It's not that weird. It's Independence Day, Holocaust Day, and Remembrance Day. That's what we call them in English. They're yeah, I guess it is. Anyway, the Yom HaShoah debate, and I think Yedida, I need to be reminded of the point you made that they felt a lot of pressure when they were making this decision in real time. It's easy to read the story that it was on the 10th of Tevet, which was a minor fast day for a year or two. They were doing it in December. In those early ceremonies, they were still burying ashes from camps, and it's a very, very different Yom HaShoah feel. And then they came up with this idea to put it halfway between Passover and then the Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut back to back. The problem is it's too much. It's too many things in a short period of time. And regardless of the subtle message that is in the backdrop of the proximity of Holocaust remembrance and Yom HaAtzmaut, I think that gets negated by the fact that it's too much stuff in a very crammed period of time. And we have this huge openness of months between Hanukkah and Purim, like where the UN picked a day where it could have been put and so much focus could be put on it. Because I agree with the idea of not putting it on Tisha B'Av to let it stand on its own. I like that argument, but I think that it needed to be given more isolation in the calendar from a practical purpose, just to be able to highlight it. And unfortunately, I think that it gets lost in all the yoms that are happening in a short period of time, plus Pesach. At the synagogue, when I worked at the synagogue, there was all this overload and fatigue coming out of Pesach, and here we were trying to do a Yom HaShoah commemoration, and then there was a Yom HaZikaron and a Yom ha-Atzmaut. Having those back-to-back, that message is amazing, from remembrance and paying right into celebration. But I think that I wish I'd been around and maybe been invited to weigh in. Not that they would have listened to me. No one really listens to me, I hope, except for the listeners of this podcast. But I just think that Yom HaShoah is so powerful, but we lose it where it's placed. I don't know. Am I allowed to say that? I hope I don't get tagged as being a bad guy.
Matthew, you said this thing offhandedly, the yoms. And
yeah.
I have heard this term, and in the past it was like this insidery term amongst like Jewish professionals. Like, oh, we got to get on the yoms this year. Like, they're all this point or not. You've heard this term before, right?
To talk about specifically like Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, Yom ha-Atzmaut?
Yeah, the yoms, right? And I've heard this like I said, as insidery, like Jewish professionals refer to it as that. And I got an email last week from a Jewish organization, and they're like, this is how we're celebrating the yoms this year. Right, here's the schedule for the yoms. And I really got turned off by that. And I was like, I had to stop and ask myself, like, it took me 2 days to figure this out. And I asked my wife, I was like, why do you think like I'm so turned off by this, like using the yoms in an email?
So what was it?
And she was like, oh, it's obvious. I know you. She's like, it's because it's become a marketing term. And these are holidays that are like, why do we want to market them in this, like, oh, the yoms, it's like shorthand. And like, that's not, you're trying to make it cool. And it's like, no, it's important. You would never do this for like, hey, what are we celebrating for Hanukkah this year?
Kind of dismissive.
You know?
Yes, I agree with this take, actually, very much so. Like, but this is kind of part of what I was talking about before. Like, we've been desensitized to it by having too many of them in a close period of time, that it's almost become kind of comical, right? Like, look how many days in a week and a half period or week period they all have Yom Day, Yom, Yom, Yom. They're the Yums, right? Like, it's inviting it to be almost kind of made into a weird joke, which is the complete opposite. So
I think it's important for us, like, also to name that Judaism is like, we're like, our whole tradition is steeped in memory. And so, first of all, I think yoms is like dismissive. I think it diminishes the gravity.
It's like Kab Shab for Kabbalat Shabbat. You've heard this also?
Awful.
I don't have a problem with that. Like, that I'm absolutely totally fine with.
I don't like it either.
It doesn't, right? But it, I mean, maybe it should have more gravity in my head than it does. But we're still scrambling to make Shabbos here. But yeah, I think yoms is sort of like diminishes the gravity of the day. But our entire calendar, everything is about history. Hanukkah is about history. Purim is about like maybe history, maybe another topic for next Purim. But like all of our holidays are about memory. Judaism is steeped in memory. We talked a little bit last week about how like our liturgy like imposes, right, has this memory engineering in it, right? The I think Musaf for holidays and for Rosh Chodesh, right, says like, because of our sins, we've been exiled from the land. And like, that's historical, right? All of this it's shaping our memory and our attitude towards history and the calendar. And I think one of the things that we're sort of talking about here is, okay, these are modern holidays, right? This isn't in the Mishnah, right? Like the Torah doesn't tell me how to celebrate or commemorate this one. And the modernity of it, I think, is for those of us who are like, you know, constantly commemorating the ancient history, it feels jarring also to sort of shift into contemporary.
Well, here's my argument for Tisha B'Av, even though I don't fully believe this, but I feel like there have been so many tragedies, and to commemorate them each with their own day, I feel like our calendar would be so filled with so many days where we're like, oh, this is sad. Oh, this is sad. Oh, this is sad. And we do have plenty of holidays too, but I feel like being able to say, you know what, we're going to take all of those days. We're going to say Tisha B'Av is the day that anything that happens post the destruction of the temple, that we are going to go and use that as the day to commemorate those things. And I think about it very much when it comes to October 7th, because there's going to become, I even hesitate to say, but an overabundance of memorials, whether days or whether physical spaces or whether moments and books, post October 7th studies. Like, this is going to become a thing. And I'm afraid that it is going to become a thing because I don't think that that's good for Judaism today. I think it's too fragile to handle yet another tragedy and commemorating it constantly. So I think that the argument for Tisha B'Av is to sort of say, well, let's take all the sadness and put it in one space so that we can actually move forward with our lives.
I like that. I mean, I'm not hard to convince on that because I think that then you build into a day with history and you build into a day with ritual, a day that is like the low point day. And unfortunately, you're right. History has shown that if we gave every single day its day, we could fill the calendar, unfortunately, with commemoration days.
And let's just name also that, like, this is totally intentional, right? Like, the Mishnah talks about the historical events that happened on Tisha B'Av that are commemorated on Tisha B'Av. There were 5 on Tisha B'Av and there were 5 on Asara B'Tevet. And did those historical events all happen on the same day? Were both temples really destroyed on the same day? Sorry, there's the historian. But this is intentional, like, memory engineering, right? This isn't like historical fact necessarily. Like, I wasn't there. But there is something to be said about identifying how Jewish leaders, just like other community leaders, think about how we commemorate different moments and engineer those. And it's not an accident that all of this happens now. Before the Holocaust, the sort of most recent, earlier major anti-Jewish violent event was the Kishinev pogrom in 1904. I think that 49 Jews were murdered, something like that. And Chaim Nachman Bialik was sent there to document that historical event and to like write the history of it. And we know that he did all this historical research. We have his notebooks. And then he wrote this incredible poem, Be'ir HaHariga, in the City of Slaughter, about the event. And he kind of blames the victims, which is not how it went down. There was organized Jewish resistance. The Jews did fight back, but instead he blames them for their own victimhood and that they didn't fight back. And then that poem becomes sort of a call to arms for Jewish militarism after that. So I think that there's also like a layer here for us to discuss about sort of the use of history and the use of memory and how the way we remember historical events does and doesn't necessarily comport with how they happened. And we, modern historians, try to do a better job of documenting events as they happened, but ancient and pre-modern historians are not doing that.
I love that term, memory engineering. I've never heard that before, but I know exactly what it means. And I think about it because of the juxtaposition of Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, right? Where you say, we want to celebrate this thing, the independence, the joy that we have of having a country, but we cannot do that until we commemorate those who have fallen because of that. And the transition point, that's the thing. Like, I only celebrated Yom HaAtzmaut as an adult. I went to a very Haredi yeshiva. It was not part of the culture. And it was only as an adult that I would start going to these, tefillah, these services for Yom HaZikaron into Yom HaAtzmaut. And you have these really somber, serious, thoughtful commemorations. And then 5 minutes later, it's like, we're going into Mariv and we are going to do Hallel and sing and dance. And this, like, from the darkness to the great light, that's total engineering. That puts it all together and says, we can't just focus on the sad. We have to have the joy and we have to move forward. And what do they say for the Nova victim? We will dance again, right? All, like, this is what it is. And that's memory engineering for me. And that, to me, is the experience of Yom HaAtzmaut, is more than just eating Israeli food or going to the Israel Day, the Yom HaAtzmaut parade in Montreal, the walk like through downtown. The experience for me is going to a service and finishing with Yom HaZikaron and moving right into Yom HaAtzmaut.
I think it's interesting, right? Like, you can't have Yom HaAtzmaut without Yom HaZikaron, right? Like, they have to go together. I love the timing of him. I said that before, but so the now it's called the Gray Academy. It used to be Joe Selinsky Collegiate. Amazing tradition for Yom HaAtzmaut, a song festival where the students in the school write songs. Obviously, Israel is going to be the main theme, and there's like the categories of like the senior, the middle, the old, right? And then a band, like a talented band, usually with some kind of connection to some alumni in the school. I was in the band for a little bit.
Was it the Watchmen? Because that would have been so
we never.
cool.
You know what? I should probably be careful. I mean, like, there's a potential that some of the guys from the Watchmen may have at some point played in the song festival band. If you want me to, if you're daring me to name drop, like one of my really good buddies is this guy named Ariel Posen, who is making a name for himself as a guitarist in his own right in places like Nashville. And so he ran the band for a long time. But yeah, you write these songs, the band sets it to music, you perform them live, judges vote on them to celebrate. And I was also telling people around here trying to get something done at the Simpkins Center, we used to do this thing in elementary school, school-wide bingo, where you had to make your own card, like Israel-themed card, and then they announced it over from the principal's office over the speakers. And it wasn't just the thrill of being able to win, but you were like allowed to run from your classroom to the principal's office. It was like school-sanctioned running down the halls whenever you won bingo, which of course eluded me my entire life. I never won once. But yeah, like as you can see, very positive celebratory memories for Yom HaAtzmaut, for sure.
Yedida, what did you have?
I'm trying to think. I don't have like overwhelming strong memories. In Toronto, I went to public school, so I wasn't in sort of in one of the, I didn't go to Chat, I didn't go to Ulpana. So that wasn't like baked into my high school experience. And then, yeah, I think that probably my strongest memory is I went to a super Zionist seminary in Israel, in the Old City after high school and before my undergrad. And as the graduation present at the end of the year, our Israeli madrichot made us like a mixtape with like basic Israeli songs that everybody would know. So for like years later, I would like drive around Toronto and listen to this music and think about how really I wanted to be living in Israel because I'd hoped to stay there, and for various reasons didn't. My life clearly went in a totally different direction. But no, those songs still to this day, I'm sure would like bring tears for the association and the time that I spent there. But the parting gift that the school gave us was a machzor, a special liturgical prayer book for Yom HaAtzmaut. And the school was overtly religious Zionist. And then the summer camp I would work at for those 5 summers also was overtly religious Zionist and really imbued religious significance into the state, which is complicated. And so later on, when I was in grad school in New York on Yom HaAtzmaut, I remember going to the mincha service downstairs. And like, I think I didn't even know that there was a special Haftorah for like the afternoon of Yom HaAtzmaut for religious Zionists, and other additions to the prayers. You know, in retrospect, also recognizing that our Yom HaAtzmaut is a very different day, commemorated very differently for Palestinians. It's a really tough one, right? Like the day for two peoples who live side by side and are still fighting it out has completely different significance. You know, maybe we'll talk about postmodernism another time, for all of its faults. But it's a day that has, you know, I want to celebrate my joy and my independence and the fact that Jews have sovereignty for the first time in 2000 years. But like that thing that is a good thing for me and my people has not been a good thing for a lot of other people.
Totally. One of the most moving representations of that paradox, of that tension that you're talking about, Yedida, is a moment that I had when I went to Beersheba. And one of the things that they brought us on was a tour of this school that was equal parts, like half the student population of this elementary school was Israeli and half the population was Palestinian. And they did everything together meaning they would do a Seder together and they would do Ramadan together. And they were just always celebrating everything together so that we could learn from each other, except that on Yom HaAtzmaut, they would go and have separate things. And they would, the Israeli students would have Yom HaAtzmaut, the Palestinian students would have the Nakba. And there was this recognition that it's really, really hard to bridge that gap. And it really hit home that, like, even in a place where everything is done together and you're really trying to seek for this understanding, you really can't teach the two together, at least not to elementary school students. And there's real difficulty in that. So yeah, what you're saying there, I hear that. On that note, Matthew, have you felt Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut much different in the past couple of years? Do you feel it different this year than last year?
Yeah, I do.
How
I
so?
do, because maybe not Yom HaZikaron, but maybe Yom HaAtzmaut. And what I mean by that is I think Yom HaZikaron, I always compare Yom HaZikaron to Remembrance Day in Canada, because that's what it is, right? It's Israeli Remembrance Day against Canadian Remembrance Day. Canadian Remembrance Day always feels so far away for me, right? The events that happen, and it always feels so far away because I'm not naive. I know that there are soldiers. I know there's a Canadian army. I know there are missions, and I know that people die, and I know that's happening. But it always feels like what Remembrance Day, the poetry, the assemblies in school, there are very few veterans left. Everything feels like World War I, World War II. That seems to be like Canada's like military history from long ago. And it's always harder to relate to things when they feel less recent, right? Like, it's not a recency bias. It hits you differently. But in Israel, Remembrance Day is both not that long ago. We're not talking about World War I and World War II. We're talking about wars more recently. But even still, we're also talking about victims of terror. And Noah Tishby has this incredible line in her book. I had a chance to interview her, and she was in Winnipeg, and it was on the time of Yom HaZikaron. I read the page in the book, and it's just this idea that we all know everyone in Israel has someone that they are remembering. It's so different from the experience in Canada. So October 7th didn't change that. But October 7th changed Yom HaAtzmaut for me, because now you're never sure who you're talking to when you say you're celebrating Israel for whatever reason, what that person on the street's reaction to you is, right? For some people out there, Israel is like this 4-letter word. It's crazy. And I did not feel that for most of my life until the last couple of years, until October the 7th. And therefore I feel that, and I think other people feel that, especially on days like Yom HaAtzmaut, when Israel is front and center. And I always wonder to myself, like, what is the average person thinking on the street? Because I can't control what they've read, where their information comes from, all these sorts of things, what their, preconceived notion of Israel is. And here am I celebrating Israel. And I'm never going to stop because of that, but I'm just saying that, like, you asked me how I feel it. I feel it differently, because for some people, Israel is, it's the source of huge issues at soccer games, at the Olympics, like on the national stage. I mean, Israel gets slammed, and then you go and stand cheering for Israel. There's always going to be something built-in weird about that.
I hear that. We touched on the fact that it feels very different post October 7th, and that it's so new and so fresh. I can't figure out for myself, because I don't actually think that it's that different, because October 7th stands outside of the idea of Yom HaAtzmaut in my mind. Yom HaZikaron not so, because there are soldiers and other victims of terrorists that have passed away, like, because of October 7th. That's the essence of what we're doing there. But Yom HaAtzmaut really stands on its own in this way of saying, no, we're celebrating the day that we got independence, and has nothing to do with our weaknesses. We don't think about the sadness of any other failures that we've had within Israeli society. We don't stop to think about even other successes. And I actually think that one of the greatest losses is that the Yom that is the most underrated one and the most underthought of is Yom Yerushalayim. And because it doesn't show up like immediately a few days after or around whatever the day is, we don't stop to think about it, and we don't have that same visceral reaction. And Yom HaAtzmaut has this, like, no, this is about then, and it's not about October 7th. And yet everybody seems to be making it about October 7th, or not everybody. I speak in binaries. This is like everybody's favorite problem with Avi Feingold is that I speak in binaries, but I don't mean everybody.
Avi, on the one hand, I agree that, like, Yom HaAtzmaut is Yom HaAtzmaut, even if October 7th was yesterday. But I think that for a lot of people, it's still October 7th.
Tell me about it.
Right. No, there's still hostages in Gaza. And like, if we think about this within the framework of how Jews mourn and Shiva and Shloshim and the 11 months or the year of Kaddish, like we're still right at the beginning of that because there are still people, in tunnels and caves in Gaza being tortured. And so I think as long as that's still on for a lot of people, they can't move past it. And I personally feel very removed, and I have a hard time keeping the hostages present in my mind. And I, won't have a hard time on that count celebrating Yom HaAtzmaut. But I think it's a lot to ask, right? Like, yeah, I think it's just still really fresh, right? Like, just like we were saying, the people who established Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura were really still living it. It wasn't over for them. It's October 7th is not over for Israelis.
Yeah.
It's not over for Americans either. I personally just own that I feel totally removed from it and I'm not there. And that experience is not my experience.
Yeah, that's actually a very strong point. I feel like when you think of it that way, though, how many Yom HaAtzmaut have really been a Yom HaAtzmaut we could freely celebrate, right? Like if we're waiting for the perfect circumstance to celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut where we don't have to have our mind on something else, I don't know if we're ever going to get one. I don't know if we've ever gotten one. I just don't know. I think that's just kind of the nature, right? A lot of the people who weigh in, I think very aptly in these kinds of conversations talk about the fact that you can't let, easy to say, right? And like you make a great point about not being in Israel, but you can't let the terror win. You can't let the fear win. You can't let it rob us of the joy that we find in our lives and our heritage and our story and our people, our culture, our everything. And this is our day. And so we have to, and that's what we talked about just earlier, even today. That's why we put Yom HaZikaron literally right next to it, because even in the years where there may not be, God willing, next year, God willing, all of them, no hostages, no war, there will always be something that will butt up right against the joy of Yom HaAtzmaut, and that's why we put those days there. So I feel like it's also, I also do agree with you on the sense that it feels very easy for us to kind of say and to kind of point and say this is how you should celebrate it. But when I think about it in my own life, I don't want to not celebrate it. I know you're not supposed to talk like that, but I want to be very present and very full of joy. I feel like that's what I want. I don't know if I can, but that's what I want.
I mean, it's part of our tradition to commemorate the hard stuff, even in our greatest moments of joy.
Exactly.
So we can do both. We can walk and chew gum on this.
We need to find the October 7th equivalent of like horseradish or maror that we have to have.
Well, I do kind of like, there's like an interesting thing to me with these modern days, right? Where do we stand with trying to bring more ritual? Is it a good idea to try and bring ritual into these days? Like Yedida, you made this point. I worked at a shul for close to 20 years. We never did anything on Yom HaAtzmaut. We never did anything to mark Yom HaAtzmaut except maybe put up a flag or say a special prayer. Like
there was no programming or there was no ritual element.
I'm talking about from a ritual perspective, right? Like I'm talking about the fact that so much of the things you talk about are memory and our history, and I agree with you on all of that. But in Israel, Yom HaShoah isn't a day off, but it's a day when things are closed. Would we even, as a religion, entertain the idea of trying to make one of these days like an actual no work day? Like how far are we prepared to take it in the idea of establishing it, making it present? I mean, like with all great respect to Shavuot, like I'm trying to say that we shouldn't celebrate Shavuot, but it's very hard to walk down the street and explain to somebody why you take this day off. It'd be a lot easier to say I'm taking off Holocaust Remembrance Day. This is like a day that we need to commemorate with more ritual or more something. I don't know. I just feel like it's not enough sometimes.
We're in the point in time when this stuff is working itself out, right? I can't remember for the life of me who told this to me, but it's always stuck with me. Tradition is innovation that doesn't suck, right? And we're in the place in history where we're creating the traditions for the future of Yom HaAtzmaut. We're just in the baby steps of what that takes, right? And we have to remember that it took 2,000 years for the Seder to take the shape that it has today. And it didn't just show up in 1 week. And they went to the ritual committee, right? And they were like, hey, ritual committee, come up with the Seder for us. And they came back 1 year and here's your Seder, there's your Haggadah, and that's it. So it's this process, it's iterative process, but then eventually it does pick up certain things. And that's where we're at right now.
Right. So I can totally get on board with the barbecue and the old school Israeli classics and the dancing. That I'm always up for that.
Let's move on to some Torah. For this week's question, I wanted to turn to the Torah portion, and I get to the Torah portion, and it's Tazria and Metzora and the laws of Tzarat. And I mean, we don't actually know what this skin affliction is. I've heard theories that it was melanoma. I've heard theories that it was psoriasis style, and that's actually where the term psoriasis comes from, is Tzarat. In truth, look, let's be honest, it doesn't correspond with any known disease, right? It can appear on your clothing. It can appear on your home. But let me focus on one really fascinating moment. The Torah tells us that before you call the Kohen, who's going to diagnose the wall of your house and decide if it's tzarat or not, you take all of your possessions out of the house. Now, the Mishnah points out that it's because once it's impure, all the vessels inside the home become impure also. Earthenware, pottery, those things cannot become pure again. So there's this obvious question, right? Shouldn't those vessels automatically become impure once they're in the home with the tzarat? They're just impure. And the answer that the Talmud gives is that, no, they only become impure once the Kohen declares the tzarat. So it's not this thing of tzarat until it's declared by the Kohen to be tzarat. And I love how this fits in with two different things, right? So first of all, it fits in with what we said last week about the Torah being in human hands, right? It's not automatic. It takes a person to go and say, this is or this is not, this is, this isn't. And that's really, fits in with our theme of not in heaven. The Kohen has to declare it. But what I love even more about that is that there are loopholes that get enshrined, right? Like in the Torah text, right? I love a system of law that understands loopholes need to exist. And there's often a way around this, right? Without being against the law. This fits in very much with what you said, Matthew, about spirit versus the letter of the law. And that's the kind of you think about these things with your, work all day. And I guess I wanted to ask you guys, just in a lighter way, do you have any favorite loopholes? And this could be in Monopoly or in halacha that you're just oh yeah, I exploit this one all the time. And I'm totally down with it, and I have no problem talking about it.
Just the tzara thing is so funny because the first time my wife ever came to hear me read Torah at a shul in Halifax back in 2007 or 2008, it must have been 2008 in the spring, it was this parsha. And afterwards, we went out for lunch, and she's like, what in the hell was that? It's a couple of chapters of very convoluted, disturbing. Plus, from a hygienic perspective, I think if there's tzarat in the house and the plates are compromised, the Kohen can't just wish that away because he didn't say anything. I mean, the whole thing is very, very suspect. My favorite loophole was always the idea that you could get someone to turn on your AC on Shabbat, your non-Jewish neighbor, but you couldn't ask them directly. So I remember we were visiting these people one time in New York, and they were frum, and he was telling me the story about how one time they forgot to turn on their air conditioning before Shabbat, and it was like a hot New York day, and so they were in a lot of trouble. And you can't go to your non-Jewish neighbor and be like, can you please turn this on for me? That violates it, right? So he was saying that he was standing in the doorway being like, man, it is so hot in my apartment, just hoping that he would kind of be like, oh, let me come and open, right? And he was just trying every single way to be this is okay as long as I don't ask him. Boy, oh boy, do I wish that my air conditioning was turned on right now. Holy, would that save my life? I just thought that was a clever loophole.
Totally. Did you got anything for us?
So the first things that came to mind were a whole bunch of things that I learned in the laws of family purity last year, but I think not going to get into the details with that now. But what I will offer up here, and you guys can take this and run with it if you want, we have started in my family setting up a waffle iron to go on in the mornings on Yom Tov. As some of our listeners will know and others won't, one is not allowed from a halachic perspective to cook on Shabbat. And the rabbis have like a whole big, long, complicated definition of cooking. And I have an exam due on Monday on that very topic. But on Yom Tov, there are allowances to cook. And so given that a lot of people do cook on Yom Tov to have fresh food or to, because it feels exceptional, right? Or like maybe just to teach your kids that Yom Tov has different rules than Shabbat. So one of the ways that we do that is we invested in a 7-day timer. And when we moved, my husband would not let us get rid of the waffle iron we had never used. And because I was like, can we get rid of this? Now we use it. So he programs it to go on at whatever time. He wakes up earlier and makes his recipe for like thick, heavy, whole wheat Belgian waffles and do like a waffle buffet. And sometimes people come over on Yom Tov for waffles before they go to shul. And it's a Yom Tov treat. And I guess like timers, right? Getting a 7-day timer and setting up, this or that or the waffle iron so that we can do fun things like that, I guess is its own kind of loophole.
All right. Mine is just as Shabbat and holiday related. And it's literally the biggest loophole of them all. And it's the Eruv. And I know that you're going to say that the Eruv isn't a loophole. But first of all, my favorite line about the Eruv is Calvin Trillin once referred to it in The New Yorker as the Eruv is the magic schlepping circle. Right. And I was like, oh, yeah, that I can identify with. And I've been fascinated with Eruv for decades. I've taught about Eruv. I've been part of Eruv committees. I've checked Eruvs. I love everything there is about Eruv. But the thing that I like to point out is that the thing that you're not allowed to do because of the Eruv is carry outside. Now, every other category of work on Shabbat feels like it sort of makes sense, right? Weaving and slaughtering and gardening, like anything real creative work. But like what's the creativity involved in carrying from one space to the next? It doesn't feel like it's a real creative act. And my way of looking at it is that the prohibition of carrying on Shabbat exists so that you can build Eruvs in a community. They're basically saying, we want you to live in communities. We want you to be able to carry on Shabbat. We don't let you unless you're in this space and you've created this virtual boundary that says this is the neighborhood. And the whole point of Eruv is just about community and it's not about carrying. So in that sense, it's this huge loophole that you're allowed to carry now in this space, but it's really the most ideal thing you can do, which is we want you to carry and bring a bottle of wine to your friend's house when you go to Shabbat dinner.
You don't think they were just in cahoots with real estate agents?
Oh, yeah, 2,000 years ago, for sure.
But there is certain conspiracy.
No, I have a friend who did his master's thesis looking at the home prices, because there's this known fact that home prices closer to a church or closer to a house of worship are more expensive. And he wanted to see, as an urban planning project, whether this was extendable to Eruv. And so he looked at streets in various cities inside and outside an Eruv, where you have like one side of the street is inside the Eruv and one side of the street is outside the Eruv. And the prices inside the Eruv are actually more expensive. They tend to go. Yeah. So that's there.
But there is some kind of element of conspiracy theory within even just your idea that the rule might have been created just to force community. I'm not saying I'm against that, but I think it's
they knew what they were doing.
They knew what they were doing. Hey, well, it's all about Eruv. I think that's Avi Feingold. I like that.
Thank you for listening to Not in Heaven. Our producer and editor is Zachary Kaufman. Michael Freeman is the executive producer. Mark Weisblatt is the editorial director. To catch every episode, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to support our show, consider making a donation to the CJN at thecjn.ca/donate. If you want to keep up with everything else at the CJN, get our free newsletter at thecjn.ca/newsletter.
On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.